Hi, everyone. Today we're stepping into a story that feels like it belongs in a movie, but it happened in real life and it could happen to someone you love. Imagine giving everything to your country only to be questioned at the gates of honor, treated like a stranger by the very people who should salute your sacrifice. This story will make you feel proud, angry, and maybe even a little heartbroken. But stay with me because what starts as quiet dismissal becomes something unforgettable. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what time is it, where you're watching, and where are you tuning in from? All right, let's begin. The morning sky over Washington, D.C. hung low and cold, a flat gray that dulled the shine of even the most polished boots. The air was stiff with early March chill, and the city moved like it was trying to warm up slowly, one cautious step at a time. From the bus stop 2 blocks down, Leonard Hayes stepped onto the sidewalk with the kind of measured grace that comes from experience and aching joints. His coat was neatly buttoned. His hands, covered in thin gloves, gripped a faded army duffel in one and a wooden cane in the other. He stood for a moment beneath the towering iron arch of Arlington National Cemetery, letting his eyes adjust to the uniform solemnity of the place. It hadn't changed. Not really. White stones trimmed hedges, the soft hum of security radios, and distant footsteps. What had changed was him. Leonard was 78 years old, soft-spoken, and built like a man who used to be stronger than he looked. A retired Army sergeant from Roanoke, Virginia. He hadn't been back to Arlington since the burial of his unit commander back in '95. Today he wasn't here for a ceremony or a photo op. He was here to say goodbye to General Marcus Trenton, the man who once crawled through jungle gunfire to drag Leonard from the wreckage of an ambushed convoy in the NK Pass. Marcus Trenton, a four-star general with medals to his name, and a national funeral with all the fixings. But to Leonard, he was just Marcus, not the rank, the man, the one who bled beside him, prayed with him, and once shared the last can of peaches in a rain-drenched trench. Leonard had received the printed invitation 2 weeks ago, unexpected, but addressed to him by name. Black letters on ivory paper, U.S. Army seal in gold ink instructions for arrival and etiquette. He had ironed his only navy blue suit the night before and made the 5-hour Greyhound trip with 2 transfers and a short walk. He didn't drive, never had. His daughter offered to come, but Leonard insisted this was something he needed to do alone. He made sure everything was just right. Shined his shoes, pressed his shirt, tucked the invitation into his coat pocket so many times it had started to soften at the folds. He approached the main checkpoint just outside the entrance. A white canopy tent covered 2 folding tables. Underneath, 2 uniformed military police officers checked names against a list on a tablet. Leonard moved slowly toward them, cane tapping the pavement, the duffel hanging heavily over his shoulder. One guard, maybe mid-20s, looked up and raised a hand. "Morning, sir," he said. "Can I see your ID?" Leonard reached into his inner coat pocket, pulled out the invitation, and unfolded it gently. "I don't have an ID card," he said. "I'm retired, been out 35 years. But I was invited. My name's Leonard Hayes." The guard took the paper, glanced at it, then looked at Leonard's shoes. Scuffed black leather, clean but worn. The other officer leaned over, whispered something, then turned his eyes back toward Leonard with a look that wasn't quite disrespectful, but wasn't quite respectful either. "Do you have a driver's license?" the second guard asked. Leonard shook his head. Never learned. They looked at each other again, like something about him didn't quite fit. Like they needed to double-check what kind of man showed up without a crisp uniform or someone important walking beside him. Leonard didn't flinch. He just stood tall, the paper invitation now resting on the table between them, like a courtroom exhibit. "We're going to have to verify this," the first guard said. "Please wait off to the side." Leonard nodded once. "I'll be right over there." He stepped to a stone bench just past the checkpoint, sitting down slowly with the help of his cane. His knee crackled beneath him. The invitation rested in his lap. The cold stone seeped through the fabric of his slacks. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised, just tired. Tired of the feeling that followed him his whole life, that before they saw his name, his face, his scars, they saw something else first, something they didn't trust. Guests began arriving in clusters, dark suits, crisp uniforms, women in pressed dresses and pearl earrings. Most were waved through with barely a nod. Some flashed IDs, but others just said a name and kept walking. Leonard watched it all without comment. One man arrived in a long black sedan. The window cracked briefly, just enough to flash a Department of Defense badge to the guards who stepped aside immediately. Another woman, tall, confident, wearing a navy coat and gloves, smiled at the guards and breezed right through. No invitation needed. Leonard leaned back slightly on the bench, looked up at the sky. It was starting to brighten, a weak sun fighting through the clouds. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a tissue, wiped his brow. His hand trembled slightly. He steadied it with the other. He'd done everything right. Took the bus, followed the instructions, even called ahead to confirm the date. But now he was just another figure on a bench, forgotten, unclaimed, as if his presence wasn't official until someone in a suit said it was. And yet Leonard didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, because he wasn't there for them. He was there for Marcus, and he wasn't leaving without saying goodbye. Leonard sat still, almost perfectly so, like a monument no one had ordered, cast in old bone, in silence. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his watch. He simply waited, eyes scanning the faces of those who passed through the gate like they belonged. In truth, most didn't even glance in his direction. If they saw him at all, they saw a man in worn shoes and an oversized coat resting under an overcast sky. They didn't see the bronze star tucked into a box at the bottom of his duffel. They didn't see the scar on his left shoulder from a night ambush in '69. They didn't know that the man on that bench once held his commanding officer's hand as he died in the dirt beside a blown-out Jeep. They saw nothing. The cold seeped deeper into his knees, biting at the joint like a dull blade. But Leonard didn't move. He stared ahead toward the rows of white headstones stretching into infinity. The silence was heavy but familiar. A soldier's silence. His fingers fumbled with something in his coat pocket. A photograph, creased, weathered, almost sepia from age. 4 men, all young, all dirty, all smiling like they hadn't a care in the world. Marcus was the tallest, shirt half off, dog tags dangling. Leonard stood next to him, helmet askew, toothpick in his mouth. The photo had been taken on a dare after a firefight when the sun came up and they realized they'd made it through. That was the morning Marcus said, "If I ever make it back, I'm going to buy a boat and name it after you, Lenny." He never bought a boat, but he kept a promise deeper than that. He never forgot who dragged him by the collar when his leg was torn to shreds. Leonard smiled faintly at the memory, folding the photo with care and sliding it back into his coat. The scrape of footsteps caught his attention. Small ones. A boy, maybe 10 years old, walked toward the bench, shoes polished to a high gloss, a blazer slightly too big for his narrow shoulders. He had the unmistakable look of someone who had been told to dress nice and stay quiet. But now, drawn by something outside the plan, he wandered over, eyes wide and curious. "You here for the funeral?" the boy asked. Leonard turned his head slowly and nodded. "Yes, I am." The boy studied him. "Are you a soldier?" was Leonard replied. "Long time ago." The boy sat on the bench beside him without being told. Leonard raised an eyebrow but didn't stop him. "My grandpa's inside," the boy said. "He served too. He said the general was the real deal. Knew him from way back." Leonard glanced at him. "Did he now?" The boy nodded. Said he wasn't like the other officers. He cared. Leonard chuckled. "That's true." The boy noticed the edge of the photograph peeking from Leonard's pocket. "Is that you?" Leonard pulled it out again, holding it so the boy could see. "That's me on the left," he said, pointing. "And that's General Trenton before he was a general. Just a tall kid from Mississippi with too much heart and not enough sense." The boy smiled. "You were friends," Leonard's voice softened. "We were brothers. Different blood, same war." The boy looked thoughtful for a moment, then said, "You should be in there." Leonard looked at him and gave a small nod. "Maybe, but sometimes folks don't see past the surface." The boy stood brushing his pants. "I hope they let you in." And just like that, he walked off toward the gates again, disappearing into the stream of guests. Leonard watched him go, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. The boy had seen him, not as a relic, not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. Inside the tented ceremony area, rows of white chairs were quickly filling. Uniforms and medals glinted beneath soft lighting. A military band stood ready to play. The casket draped in the American flag lay at the center beneath a canopy, surrounded by brass and command. But one chair near the front remained noticeably empty. Margaret Trenton, dressed in a fitted black suit with a silver brooch, sat in the first row. Her eyes sharp and still scanned the rows as if something was missing. Because something was. She leaned over to a man seated beside her, a middle-aged aide with a Bluetooth in one ear, and whispered, "Did Leonard Hayes arrive?" The aide blinked. "I'm not sure." Margaret narrowed her gaze. "He was invited. I'll check." She nodded curtly, returning her eyes to the front, but the tension in her shoulders remained. The aide exited the tent phone already in hand. Within a few minutes, his voice reached the ears of someone who hadn't expected to hear the name Leonard Hayes that morning. General Samuel Davenport was in his dress blues near the side of the seating area, speaking with a pair of colonels when his phone buzzed. The moment he heard the name, his expression shifted. Without another word, he handed off his coffee, buttoned his jacket, and strode toward the front gate. Back at the checkpoint, the guards still hadn't moved. They were looking down at their screens, scrolling through names, still pretending to verify something that should have taken 2 minutes. Leonard had stopped asking questions. He simply sat, one leg crossed gently over the other, like a man with nowhere better to be, and yet everything on the line. Then came the boots. Not just the sound, but the presence. Heavy, certain, deliberate. Leonard turned to see General Davenport approaching. Tall, broad, and silver-haired, his uniform bore 4 stars on the shoulders. The kind of stars you didn't question. The guard stood upright immediately. "Sir?" At ease, Davenport said, eyes locked on Leonard. "Mr. Hayes," Leonard slowly stood. "Yes, sir. I'm General Davenport. Marcus Trenton spoke about you often. We've been looking for you." Leonard gave a slow nod. "I've been right here." Davenport looked past him at the guards, then back again. "You ready to come in?" the general asked. Leonard looked down at the folded invitation in his hands. "Been ready for a while." Davenport extended an arm. Leonard hesitated. Then he took it. As the two men turned and walked together toward the gates, the air seemed to shift. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Even the guards, suddenly sheepish, stepped aside without a word. The ceremony, already moments from starting, slowed to a near stop as the unlikely pair approached. One man, old, quiet, walking with a cane. The other, decorated, powerful, with the weight of the U.S. Army behind every step. For the first time that day, Leonard was seen. The gravel beneath their feet crunched in a steady rhythm as Leonard and General Davenport crossed through the cemetery gates. It wasn't loud, but the silence that greeted them made every step feel like a statement. Conversations near the tent hushed. The shuffling of programs stopped. Even the brass of the military band seemed to hold its breath. From his seat near the front, a brigadier general rose, halfway squinting toward the entrance. A few officers followed his gaze. Then more heads turned. Murmurs stirred across the rows. Leonard didn't meet their eyes. He didn't need to. His gaze was fixed forward on the flag-draped casket on the empty chair beside a woman in black, on the man he had come to honor. It wasn't until they reached the first row that General Davenport slowed his pace, letting Leonard catch his breath. Leonard's right knee throbbed, but he said nothing. His cane tapped the concrete walkway once more before Davenport stopped and turned to Margaret Trenton. The widow of the general stood without hesitation. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. Her eyes filled with recognition, not surprise. She stepped forward and took Leonard's hand with a firmness that could only come from memory. "Lenny Hayes," she said softly. "You made it." Leonard nodded, eyes glassy. "I wasn't sure I would." She looked toward the guards still standing at the edge of the tent, then back at him. "Neither was I. But I'm glad you did." Without ceremony, she turned and gestured to the empty seat beside her, the one that had remained untouched even after every other seat was filled. "For you," she said. Leonard hesitated for a fraction of a second. His body hurt. His pride had bruises. But in that moment, the noise of all that injustice faded. Because this was the moment that mattered. He lowered himself gently into the chair cane, resting across his lap. Davenport stepped back quietly and took a seat at the end of the row. A chaplain, standing near the podium, cleared his throat, eyes scanning the gathering. Margaret gave a small nod, and the service began. The band played a low hymn, slow and reverent. Words followed words of duty, of courage, of legacy. The chaplain spoke of service records and valor of Marcus Trenton's decades of leadership, from jungle warfare in Vietnam to briefings in the Pentagon. Stories of medals earned lives, saved decisions made in the highest of rooms. But Leonard barely heard them. His mind was in a different place. He was 23 again, lying in the dirt, blood pooling near his ribs. Smoke thick in the air. His squad had been pinned for hours. Then out of nowhere, Marcus had appeared, one leg already torn from shrapnel, dragging Leonard by the collar toward a ditch barely deep enough to hide in. "You're not dying today," Lenny Marcus had growled through his teeth. "Not on my watch." That was the Marcus Leonard knew. Not the general, the man. Beside him, Margaret reached into her clutch and pulled out a handkerchief. She dabbed her eyes but didn't sniffle. She had the posture of someone who had already done her crying. Now she was just holding on. The flag ceremony began. 6 soldiers moved in sync, unfolding and refolding the stars and stripes with a precision that only comes from years of practice, each movement sharp, each crease deliberate. When they finished, the lead honor guard turned and presented the flag not to Margaret but to Leonard. He froze. The entire tent seemed to exhale. Margaret reached for his hand. "He would have wanted you to have it," she whispered. Leonard stared at her, at the flag, at the hands that held it out for him. And then slowly, with trembling fingers, he took it. The folded triangle sat heavy in his lap, like a weight and a gift all at once. He looked down at it, the seams perfect, the stars aligned. That flag had lain over the man who once pulled him from a burning jeep. Now it rested in his arms. The rifles fired 3 times. The cracks echoed across the cemetery like thunder rolling through history. Each shot a salute, a reminder. Then came taps, soft and solitary, that familiar bugle cry that always reached deeper than words could. Leonard didn't blink. He let it wash over him. The notes hung in the air as though suspended by memory itself. And when they finally faded, silence returned like a curtain drawn across a stage. The chaplain stepped back. The ceremony was complete, but no one moved. Not yet. Because what they just witnessed wasn't printed in the program. It wasn't part of the agenda. It was something unspoken, something sacred. Leonard finally looked up. All around him, high-ranking officers, family members, civilians, they were watching him now. Not out of curiosity, not out of politeness, but out of respect. Some with shame, some with reverence. All silent. Margaret leaned toward him one last time. "Thank you," she said. Leonard gave a small nod. "No," he replied. "Thank you for remembering." As guests began to rise, shuffling quietly out of their rows, a young officer stepped forward. Clean-cut, no older than 35, chest full of ribbons. He removed his hat and crouched beside Leonard's chair. "Sir," he said, "I didn't know the full story. I'm sorry we didn't treat you right." Leonard looked at him, not with anger, but with something deeper. "You know now," he said softly. The officer nodded, stood and stepped away. Behind him, one of the guards from the gate lingered, unsure whether to approach. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. He looked like he wanted to say something, an apology maybe, but the words didn't come. They didn't need to. Leonard met his eyes, gave the smallest shake of his head, and looked back at the flag. That was enough. It was all the answer the man needed. And for the first time that day, Leonard didn't feel like he was on the outside. He was exactly where he belonged. The sun had broken through the clouds by the time most of the guests had left their seats. It wasn't warm exactly, but it added a softness to the marble, a quiet dignity to the hills of white headstones rolling across the cemetery grounds. Leonard remained seated, the folded flag pressed gently against his chest, his cane resting between his knees. Margaret Trenton stayed beside him, saying little. There was a stillness between them, not awkward, not stiff, just shared. They both knew what this moment meant, and that words couldn't add to it. Eventually, she reached over and gave his hand a light squeeze. "If you need a ride back into the city," she said, "we have a car waiting." Leonard smiled faintly. "I appreciate it, but the bus stop's just a block away." "Been walking that road all my life." She nodded. "I thought you'd say that." He turned to her, voice low. You kept that seat open. You knew I might be turned away. I also knew she replied you wouldn't leave. There was something about the way she said it, without fanfare, without pride, just certainty. That quiet kind of knowing that only comes from years of watching someone do the hard thing over and over because it's right. A pause passed between them. You know, Leonard said when we were stationed in Pleiku, Marcus used to talk about you. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Did he all the time? Said you made better cornbread than the army cooks, and that you could iron a uniform better than base laundry? She laughed softly. That man never stopped bragging. Leonard nodded. He also said you were the only person he was afraid of disappointing. Her eyes shimmered. She said nothing. He stood slowly, flag still tucked beneath one arm. His body protested, joints stiff and unforgiving, but he didn't wince. Margaret rose with him. From a few yards away, General Davenport approached, moving slower. Now the fire of ceremony replaced with something gentler. You good? He asked Leonard. I'm whole, Leonard replied. Davenport looked at the flag in his arm. He'd be proud. Leonard looked back over his shoulder at the casket now being prepared for final transport. He always was. They stood in silence for another long moment. Then Leonard extended a hand. Thank you for coming to get me. Davenport shook it firmly. I should have been there sooner. No, Leonard said. You showed up right on time. As the crowds thinned and the color guards stood at ease, Leonard turned to walk toward the edge of the grounds. Every step echoed with memory. He passed younger soldiers who saluted him now, eyes lowered with humility. He passed civilians who had once walked past him without a glance. Some of them nodded, others stepped aside with reverence. But Leonard wasn't looking for validation anymore. Not from them. Not even from himself. He was walking not as a man who needed to be seen, but as a man who had been. By the right people. The gravel turned to smooth sidewalk as he neared the gate. The same checkpoint that had stopped him hours earlier now stood open. No clipboard in hand. No questions asked. The same young MP who had once sent him aside stood at attention. As Leonard passed, the guard stepped forward, removed his cap, and placed it over his heart. Sir, the guard began, voice quiet. I'm sorry. Leonard didn't stop. He simply raised one hand gently in response. Don't be sorry, he said, not unkindly. Just do better next time. The guard's eyes lowered. He said nothing more. Outside the gates, a black SUV idled. The rear window rolled down and Margaret's voice called out. Lenny, sure you don't want that ride? He shook his head with a small smile. I think I'll walk. Let this sink in a little. She smiled back. Well, the door's open if you change your mind. And if you're ever near Alexandria, there's always a chair at my dinner table. Leonard tipped his head in gratitude. That's kind of you. The SUV rolled away gently, disappearing around the curve. Leonard turned back toward the street. He didn't walk immediately. He just stood there, an old man in a plain suit cane in one hand, flag in the other. The cars passed. A jogger trotted by with earbuds in. The world was already moving on. But for Leonard, time moved differently now. He found his bench, the same stone ledge near the flagpole where he'd waited that morning, where he'd sat invisible, unacknowledged. Only now things were different. People noticed. One man in a gray suit paused as he passed. Thank you for your service, he said sincerely. Leonard gave a nod. Another couple mid-50s dressed for the funeral stopped and spoke in hushed admiration. We didn't know who you were earlier, the woman said, but thank you for being there. Leonard simply said, thank you for seeing me now. He sat down slowly, placing the folded flag beside him on the stone. It flapped lightly in the breeze, edges crisp, colors deep. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph one more time. The four young men smiling in the jungle. Marcus flipping the bird. Himself, helmet tilted, grin wide. He studied it with the kind of focus reserved for things that matter most. Then after a long breath, he tucked the photo inside the folds of the flag. Not for storage, for safekeeping. The bus stop wasn't far, but he wasn't in a hurry. There was something about this moment that needed to be lived slowly. Because Leonard Hayes, who had once been treated like a name too faint to verify, had just walked through the gates of honor, escorted by a general, and taken a seat next to a grieving widow who remembered every promise her husband had ever made. He didn't need applause. He didn't need a statue. He just needed to be seen. And now, he was. The bench was still warm beneath him from the sun's brief but welcome appearance. Leonard sat with his hands folded over the cane across his lap, the flag resting beside him, its corners tucked neatly, like it had never been touched by wind or fingers or grief. His bones ached not from age alone, but from the long, quiet weight of having to prove who he was in places where no proof should be required. He didn't move for a while. He just watched. A groundskeeper pushed a small cart along a narrow path nearby, nodding politely as he passed. Leonard nodded back. A young woman in jeans and a black blazer walked up the sidewalk, with a man beside her, both quiet, reverent, likely, visiting a stone that bore their last name. They didn't look at Leonard the way people had that morning. They looked at him now with understanding, as though they knew without asking that he'd seen more than most. Eventually he stood again, slowly, carefully. He slid the flag under his arm and started walking one step at a time, his cane tapping softly on the sidewalk like a heartbeat. There was no rush, no place he needed to be, but here. As he reached the bus stop, the driver was just stepping off for a smoke break. Leonard raised a hand and sat gently on the metal bench under the shade of a sycamore tree. The air smelled faintly of cherry blossoms, the kind of scent that lets you know spring is near but not quite. He pulled out the small water bottle his daughter had packed for him that morning and took a sip. It was still cool, just like she'd promised. A car pulled up beside the curb. The window rolled down. It was the same boy from earlier, the one with the blazer too big for his frame and the eyes too curious to ignore anything real. His mother was in the driver's seat, but he leaned forward. "They let you in," he said with a grin. Leonard smiled. "They did. I saw you on the news just now. My mom showed me." Leonard raised an eyebrow. The boy's mom spoke next. "They're already talking about it. Some reporter said your name during the live stream. Said you served with the general." Leonard gave a quiet nod. "We did more than serve, we survived." The boy beamed like he was meeting someone famous. "That's so cool." Leonard chuckled softly. "It wasn't at the time, but it is now," the boy said. Leonard didn't argue. The light turned green. The SUV pulled away, the boy waving as it did. Leonard waved back, hands slow, steady. The bus hissed to life behind him, its doors swinging open. He stepped aboard, greeting the driver, who recognized the flag in his arms and gave a respectful nod. No questions, no ID check, just respect. He chose a window seat midway down the aisle and sat carefully. The flag lay gently across his lap once again. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Cars honked, bikes zipped by, tourists clutched guidebooks and coffees. But inside Leonard's chest, something had changed. He looked down at the flag and let out a long breath. The words of General Davenport echoed in his mind. He'd be proud. Leonard believed that, because today wasn't about what he wore, or whether his name was typed in a database. It was about the fact that justice doesn't always knock the door down. It sometimes walks slowly, cane in hand, until it's seen. A few stops later, the bus turned down a long avenue that ran parallel to the Potomac. Trees lined both sides, their bare branches just beginning to bud. Leonard's eyes traced the water, its surface still and smooth like glass, waiting for a story to reflect. He'd told no one he was coming today except his daughter. He didn't post it online, didn't bring a friend or escort, but somehow the entire world had paused just long enough to watch him cross the space between not on the list and front row seat. He hadn't demanded anything, but he had claimed something, the kind of dignity no gate could block. As the bus rolled on, Leonard leaned his head gently against the window and let his eyes drift shut, not to sleep, but to feel, to hold the quiet in his chest like a folded flag. Some stories don't shout, they whisper. They speak in the stillness between injustice and recognition, in the long hours of waiting while others are waved ahead, in the tremble of an old man's hand holding a flag meant for someone the world forgot to ask about. Leonard Hayes wasn't trying to make a point. He wasn't asking for applause or pity. All he wanted was to say goodbye, to honor a friend, a brother, a man who once bled beside him and lived long enough to wear stars on his shoulders but never stopped carrying the names of those who didn't. The way Leonard was treated that morning, it wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a reflection of the assumptions we still make, of the ways we decide who belongs where and who doesn't, of the quiet ways power can dismiss someone without ever raising its voice. But what happened next that mattered more? Because when one person stood up, when Margaret remembered when General Davenport acted, everything changed. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in on aching knees. Sometimes it's just a man in a plain suit sitting where he should have been all along. So here's the lesson. Don't wait for others to validate your worth. Don't let the uniform or title define your seat at the table. And when you see someone pushed aside, even quietly speak. Step forward, because one act of respect can stop the whole world for a moment. And in that moment, we remember what dignity truly looks like.